Well, hello folks, welcome back to the Frontier Western Heritage Channel. I'm Todd Kestner here in Bozeman, Montana, and we're going to start a series on pocket pistols. I've got several antique pocket pistols that I wanted to display and maybe test a little bit and just kind of see what the pocket pistols of the Old West were all about and what kind of ballistics and power they might have for self-defense. So I wanted to start out with some Smith and Wessons, and in 1857, the Colt patent on revolving cylinders ran out. It expired, and almost every company out there that was interested in making revolvers was ready to go. And when the date that patent expired, they just about started putting out revolvers that day. Some of them actually did start putting out revolvers that day. They had built up to the point where they could just go from there. One of those companies was Smith and Wesson, except they had something a little bit different. They had bought the Rollin White patent, and so they were the only company that could have a revolver that loaded through the back of the cylinder. And Colt had turned that one down. Smith and Wesson bought it. They waited for the revolving cylinder patent to expire. Smith and Wesson came out, and not only could you have a revolving pistol, but also do it with a cartridge. So one of the first model that Smith & Wesson came out with is what they call the model number 1, and is known as the number 1 tip-up because of the unique way that Smith & Wesson designed these things. So this is a 7-shot 22 short that Smith & Wesson put on the market, black powder of course. 1857 is when this hit the market originally, and you loaded the cylinder from the back. This, which looks kind of like a cylinder arbor itself, is really nothing more than a ejector rod to plunk the cartridges out. So that's what you'd use to plunk your 22 shells out. You could reload this and then put the cylinder right back in, and you were ready to go. Single action, spur trigger, 7-shot 22. So this gun, again, introduced in 1857. This is a second issue, which would have been introduced in 1860. And then by 1868, they put out a third issue, which had pretty much the same thing. It just had a fluted cylinder. And that ran until 1881. So this rather weak frame, you can see there's a wiggle in this one. And most of these antiques you find, there'll be a wiggle because all that holds this barrel to the frame is this one pin right up on top, and it locks down below. The locking mechanism really does nothing to help secure this, and so a lot of these have this wiggly barrel. But still, even with a 22 short, which is a pretty minuscule cartridge really when it comes to self-defense, they still sold enough of these things, over 260,000, and kept making them all the way up until 1881. So the second pocket pistol I want to talk about is the Smith & Wesson 1.5. Now Smith & Wesson actually came out with a number 2 in 1861, and the number 2 was just a blown up version of this 1.5, and it held 6 shots, had several barrel lengths, same kind of mechanism, tipped up. It shot a 32 rimfire cartridge, so this is like an overblown 22, copper cased rimfire, and held 8 grains of powder and about a 85 grain bullet. So that was your number 2. It was really a larger holster pistol, and was pretty popular. But one of the things that folks missed in the number 2 that they liked in the number 1 was the concealability and the ability to put this in your pocket and be able to carry it around concealed and really not show the whole world that you've got a firearm on you, which is really, when you look at pocket pistols, even in the Old West period, just much like today, people like smaller guns. If you're going to carry them, you're not law enforcement, you're not trying to show off your gun, you just want to have something for self-protection and have it so that nobody else really knows that you have it. And so Smith & Wesson came back after the number 2, and in 1865 introduced this 1.5. And the Smith & Wesson 1.5 was operated just like the other tip-ups. You can open up the barrel by tipping it up, put this on half cock and slide the cylinder out, load from the rear, use this to knock out your empties, and then again you reload your cylinder and you could put it back into the gun. So this was a pretty handy, more powerful cartridge by far than the 22 short, and concealable, and just a very, very popular gun. So the 1.5 Smith and Wesson. So the 1.5, introduced in 1865, also had a second issue in 1868, and it was pretty much the same gun, just had a fluted cylinder, and that ran until 1875. About 126,000 of these Smith and Wesson 32 rimfire pocket pistols were produced, and this was phased out in 1875. And then the Smith and Wesson 1.5, they still call it the 1.5. It's the Smith and Wesson 1.5 single action. Came onto the market in 1878, and very similar in size, carryability, pretty close to the 1.5. For whatever reason, they didn't call it a different thing. They called it the 1.5 single action, and they all were single actions, except a huge step forward in this particular model. And why they didn't call it the break top or something, I really don't know. But this called it the Smith and Wesson model 1.5 single action. But the unique thing here is they've gone over to the break top gun. And so now we can load from the back of the cylinder much easier. Don't have to reload or remove the cylinder at all, and can close it solid as rock. Nice strong action compared to the 1, 1.5, and 2 of the earlier generations. And of course, single action spur trigger. So the 1.5 single action was introduced with the Smith and Wesson 32 central fire. Central fire is the historic term for what we today would call center fire. Back in that day, when the nomenclature wasn't quite determined yet, they called them a central fire cartridge. So primer in the middle, just like what we're used to today. Now we've got a brass cartridge. It is identical to the nearly identical to the rimfire. Both held 9 grains of black powder. Both of them shoot an 85 grain bullet. This one just happens to have that there had been transitioned over to brass and central fire. Much easier to load into the back of the revolver, and much easier to extract with the Smith and Wesson extractor system with the break open gun. So this is the model that we're going to test, but first we've got to come up with some ammunition for it that I trust is black powder. This gun was made up from 1878 to 1892, and so none of them of this era are really rated for any kind of smokeless powder. So we've got to load them with black powder. I have some very, very old antique shells that I've been showing here. Don't know for sure what's in them, and so rather than finding out by blowing my gun up, we're going to load some 32 Smith and Wesson with black powder, and then in our next video we can head out to the range and we can test those. So now I'm out in the shop. I've got a RCBS bullet puller here, so I'm going to take the back off of it and slip one of these 32 Smith and Wessons down inside here. I'm actually kind of impressed that this bullet puller has a tight enough collet on it here to be able to hold this narrow rim 32. But now I've got a 32 Smith & Wesson hanging here. I'm going to have to hit this on the floor a few times, knock that bullet out, and we'll see what we got for powder. Well, that was easy. It took one strike, and now we've got the cartridge right here in the end. Let me set that down. And I got the bullet and some powder. So let me put this down here on the board. I want to test this stuff, show you what that's all about. But first, let's take a look at this bullet. This is that 85 grain 32 Smith & Wesson, and you can see in the very end of it, it's got a little bit of a hollow base to it with some powder stuck up in there. And very likely, again, it would help, as we talked about in other videos, would bump out that bullet and allow it to catch the rifling a little bit better. So we've got a dimpled bullet really on the back. It's not as much of a hollow point as it's almost a dimple with some powder in it. So that's kind of encouraging that regardless of the diameter dimension differences, this cartridge ought to shoot pretty well in there. So let me grab the case. So yeah, it's too, I can't even see with the naked eye. It's too dark in there to tell because not all the powder has come out. But it's a very compressed, it almost looks like black powder, but I don't think that it is quite. So we're going to test this. Let me get a little tiny screwdriver or something, scrape the rest of this out and add it to the pile I've got on down on the board. All right, well, for comparison's sakes, I have put out a pile of 3F black powder. This is old Ainsford, and we're going to look at the ignition of the black powder and then compare it to that little pile I took out of the 32 Smith and Wesson. So let me back up a little bit. Why won't that go? Well, I wouldn't say that was particularly as easy to ignite as I thought it was going to be. Usually it just takes a spark. Let's see what the Smith and Wesson powder does. Burn that for a second. Well, that does not want to go at all. Isn't that interesting? Wow, there it goes. So, yeah, my 3F was surprisingly hard to ignite. That's odd. I just wasn't getting a flame up underneath it, obviously. But whatever is in this Smith and Wesson 32, I wouldn't say ignited super easy either. It actually ignited a little more difficult, although there was a lot of smoke and it smells different. So there was a thing in this transition period between black powder cartridge and smokeless cartridge. If you look at some of the old-fashioned boxes and things, it would say semi-smokeless would be the term for the powder on the box. And so I'm wondering, these little 32s were super popular way up into the 1900s, and Ivor Johnson and Harrington and Richardson all made 32 Smith and Wesson type guns, changed them over to double action and smokeless powder. But there were so many of these things around from the 1800s that were not smokeless powder rated that they would blow up, that I'm wondering if this transition powder makes sense, that the semi-smokeless wouldn't have the kind of pressures that a regular smokeless would have, and if you happen to put it in an old gun, it still would work and not damage that firearm. I'm just guessing. I would assume that's why semi-smokeless was out there. You can see that it was very smoky, but doesn't have the sulfur smell, and more difficult to ignite than the regular black powder. So let's go back upstairs to the reloading room and see if we can't get a couple of these things loaded. All right, here in a little bit better light, I'm going to show you. This is a bullet that we just pulled out, one of them that we just pulled out, and you can see the base of it has that hollowed out area. And what that'll do is when the powder ignites behind it and the pressure sends this down the barrel, it's going to expand, it's going to flare that base and catch the rifling. So if there's some variation from gun to gun, even within the same company sometimes, this bullet will flare out and catch it rifling and remain accurate. So we're going to try to load up some of these the way any books that I've found anyway have said the way they were loaded originally. And Cartridges of the World has them loaded at 9 grains of black powder, and with this 85 grain bullet. So all I'm going to do, since black powder cartridges for Smith and Wesson, 32 Smith and Wesson, are not easy to find, they're impossible to find unless you buy antiques, I'm just pulling the bullet out, replacing the powder with black powder, putting the bullet back in, and then being able to test this with a black powder load. So one of the issues I ran into is that when I'm working with these Smith and Wesson cases, it calls for 9 grains of powder. I couldn't hardly fit 9 grains of powder in there. And I thought, how did they do this? And of course you can compress your powder load to fit, but you can't compress the load that's spilling out over the top of the case. So you got to be able to at least get 9 grains to the rim, the top of the rim of this case, and top of the neck of this case, and be able to compress it from there. And I thought, how in the world did they do that? I'm using antique, relatively antique, early 1900s cartridges that are semi-smokeless. But how did they get 9 grains of smokeless powder in there? So I searched through cartridges for a while and cleaned all these cases up. And sure enough, once I got them cleaned up, we've got a balloon head case that will take a little bit more powder than the modern case. And so if you haven't seen balloon head cases, let me just quickly draw a little diagram for you and explain what that balloon head is all about. So I am by no means an artist, but I'm going to try to show you the best I can what this balloon head case is all about. So if I've got a case, here's the edges of my case, and here's my rim on the bottom, and my primer pocket right here. And in most modern cases, this is all going to be brass. So we got a solid bottom case right here. If you look in the bottom of the case, it looks straight across. You look right here and you got a touch hole where the primer throws the flame through. So that's a regular case, what we're used to. Many times in the older cases, here's the wall of our case again. And there's our rim. And here is our primer pocket. These older cases would just leave this open. So the only brass you had was across the bottom with the primer pocket shoved up in it. And this side here, and this side here, all the way around in a circle, and if you're looking at it 3D, is open space. And so in a balloon head case, that's what they call these, on this balloon head case, I've got a little more room on either side of this primer pocket because it's just shoved up into the case. It's not closed in by brass. And so now I can fit 9 grains of powder inside of this balloon head case. So let's weigh out 9 grains of 3F and see if we can get this thing going. Well, I've got my scale zeroed, then I moved it to 9 grains. I'm just using the cap off of the old Ainsford case here because it doesn't take much. I'm not going to load enough of these. I want to change my powder measure right now from what I was previously doing. So I'm just going to tap a little of this 3F in there. If you noticed on the antique cartridge box that I showed on the screen during the intro, that actually called for, it said on the box anyway, 10 grains of powder. Now that, for the life of me, I don't know how they got 10 grains in there, because if I'm not using this balloon head case, I'm getting 7, maybe 8. And the interesting thing, wow, that is so close. I hate to just need like a grain to fall out of there. Perfect. Yeah, how they got 10 grains on those factory loads, I will never know, because these more modern Smith and Wesson with the straight bottom, not the balloon headed case, doesn't hold it. Alright, so I've got this case already belled and ready to go. So I'm going to put my 9 grains of 3F old Ainsford in here. And I've used the drop tube on this too, and it didn't make any difference on the small amount of powder. So you can see I am right at the top of the case with 9 grains. 10 grains would have just spilled out and been wasted. So this is as good as it's going to get. 9 grains. I did end up getting it in there, so that's super positive. And let me see. I want to move my press over here. And we're going to go ahead and you can hear that compressing. We're going to compress this so we can fit a bullet in it. So now I've got 9 grains 3F compressed. I'm going to put the bullet back in. And let me seat this. I'm actually going to just push it in with this till it hits the powder. There we go. I just used the bell die just to get that. I can feel that going on the bottom of the powder, know that I'm as far as I want to go. And then I'm going to go over here and put a crimp on her. It's one thing about these RCBS, or excuse me, these are Hornady dies. They're great dies. They've got a gigantic locking nut here that doesn't want to work on this press. They would be great on a single stage. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in there. All right, so now we've got a Smith and Wesson, 32 Smith and Wesson. with 9 grains of black powder, which is historically correct according to Cartridges of the World. I put a blue, purple, whatever color you want to call that, line around the around that primer so I don't get mixed up with some other 32s that I still haven't worked on yet. This looks like the antique cartridge that I started with, and I don't want to get it mixed up with one that still has the old powder in it. So I've got a new color on here, so I know that I've got this loaded and ready to go. And a couple more, and we'll be able to test. We'll be able to test the Smith and Wesson Model 1.5 single action out at the range, and let's see what it does out there. So looking forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks. Thanks for coming, and if you liked the video, please hit the thumbs up button. If you liked what you saw and would like to share it with others as well, please subscribe and encourage others to subscribe, and we will see you next time on the Frontier Western Heritage channel. Thanks a lot.
Talk.
So I wanted to start with really the first cartridge, popular anyway, cartridge pocket pistol available. Dadgummit, let's start over again. Smith and Wesson went to a number 2 after the number 1. In 1860, they put out a number 2. Shoot, I gotta look that up. I can't see nothing. Oh, for Pete's sake. It just worked over there. I just brought it from the bench, but it's hard to compress a load that's spilling out over the top of the case. And you just whacked my camera there.
I know, I saw it.